Right now, your life feels fragile. Every moment, every breath moves you forward 1 second at a time. But what if that stopped? Not time, not the world, just the one thing that defines everything: death. What if no matter what happened, you simply couldn't die? No pain could end you, no accident could stop you, no time could erase you. You would feel everything, you would experience everything, but the end would never come. At first it might sound like a gift, an escape from fear, a life without limits. But what happens when life has no end? When every second keeps going, and never lets you go? Tonight, we go beyond reality and explore what it truly means to live forever. Welcome to What If Beyond, and if you're ready to question existence itself, consider subscribing and join the journey, because beyond this point, nothing ever ends. At first, it wouldn't feel like a curse, it would feel like relief, the quiet fear that has always followed you, the one you rarely think about, but never truly escape, would be gone. That subtle awareness that everything ends would simply disappear. You wake up just like any other day. Nothing feels different. The air is the same. The light is the same. Your body feels normal. Until something happens, something small, something that under normal circumstances would have consequences. You trip, you fall, you hit the ground harder than expected. There's a moment of impact, a sharp sensation, a pause, and then nothing. No lasting pain, no damage. You stand up, confused but fine, completely fine. At first, you might ignore it. Accidents happen, bodies recover, but then it happens again, and each time you expect something to change. For your body to react, for something to break, to fail, to weaken. But it never does. No matter what happens, you remain, unchanged, untouched, and slowly a realization begins to form. Not all at once, not clearly, but quietly, in the background of your thoughts. Something is different, something fundamental. Time passes, days, weeks, months. You live your life as you always have. But now there is a question. A quiet curiosity that grows with every passing moment. What happens if something worse occurs, something that should end everything? At some point, that question becomes too strong to ignore, not out of recklessness, not out of desperation, but out of the need to understand. You test it, carefully at first, pushing limits slowly, cautiously, waiting for a reaction, waiting for something to go wrong. But nothing does. Your body doesn't fail. Your awareness doesn't fade. No matter how far you go, you come back. Still here, still conscious, still exactly as you were before. And with that realization, everything begins to change. Because fear begins to disappear. Not all fear, but a specific kind, the fear of endings, the fear that has always shaped your decisions, guided your actions, limited your risks, is no longer there, and without it, your behavior shifts. You move differently, you think differently, you act without hesitation, because consequences, the ones that once mattered most, no longer apply. At first, this feels like freedom, a life without limits, without boundaries, without the invisible line you were never meant to cross. You can go anywhere, do anything, experience everything. Nothing can stop you, nothing can take you away. And that feeling is intoxicating. It pulls you forward, encourages you to explore, to push further, to test more. Because for the first time, you are not constrained by time, or by the inevitability of an end. You are outside of it, beyond it. And for a while, that feels like power. But slowly, something else begins to appear. Not immediately, not obviously, but quietly, beneath everything else. A subtle shift in how the world feels. Because while you remain the same, Everything else does not. People around you change. They age. They grow older. Their lives move forward in the same way yours once did. But you do not follow. At first, it's not noticeable. Time passes, but the difference is small. A few months, a year, nothing significant. But as more time goes by, the gap begins to grow. You stay the same, they don't, and eventually it becomes impossible to ignore. Faces you once knew begin to look different, voices change, energy fades, and one by one, the people around you reach the point you never will. They stop, they end, and you remain. At first, this feels like loss. A deep, familiar kind of loss. But over time, it becomes something else, something harder to describe, because it doesn't stop, it repeats. Again and again and again, new people enter your life, new connections form, new memories are created, and every time, you know how it ends, not for you, but for them. And slowly, something begins to change inside you, not physically, but mentally, emotionally. Because when every connection is temporary, when every relationship has an ending, except yours, you begin to see things differently. You begin to detach, not completely, but enough to feel it, enough to notice, because forming attachments starts to feel pointless, not meaningless, but temporary in a way that becomes harder to accept. You care, but you also know that you will be the one left behind every time. And with that knowledge, the way you experience life begins to shift. Moments feel different, less urgent, less intense, because urgency comes from limitation, from knowing that time is short, that opportunities will pass, that moments will not last forever. But in your case, everything lasts, not the moments themselves, but your ability to experience more of them, endlessly. And without that limitation, something important begins to fade, the sense of value, because value is often tied to scarcity, to the idea that something is rare, limited, temporary. But when your existence has no limit, when your time cannot run out, what gives a moment its weight? What makes something matter? At first, you try to hold on to it, to preserve the feeling, to convince yourself that things are still the same. But deep down, you know they're not, because the rules have changed, and you are no longer playing by them. You are no longer part of the same system. You are something else, something outside the natural flow of life. And while that once felt like freedom, it begins to feel like separation. A quiet, growing distance between you and everything else. And that distance only continues to grow. Years pass, then decades, and eventually centuries. At some point you stop counting, because counting only makes sense when there is an end, when there is something waiting at the finish line. But for you, there's no finish, only continuation. The world around you keeps moving forward. Cities change, technology evolves, languages shift, the way people speak, think, live becomes unfamiliar. You adapt at first. You learn, you follow, you try to stay connected to the present. But the present never stays. It keeps changing, and you are always there, watching it happen, experiencing every transition, every transformation, every version of the world that replaces the one before it. At first, it's fascinating. You witness progress. You see things that once seemed impossible become normal. Ideas that once felt distant become reality. And you are there, for all of it, a constant observer in a world that refuses to stay still. But slowly, that fascination begins to fade, not because the world stops changing, but because you have seen too much of it. Patterns begin to repeat, different forms, different styles, different people. but the same underlying cycles: creation, growth, conflict, decline, and then replacement, again and again and again. At some point, nothing feels truly new anymore, only variations of things you have already experienced. And with that realization, curiosity begins to weaken, not disappear, but soften. Because surprise becomes rare, and when surprise fades, so does excitement. You continue to move through time, but time no longer feels like something you are part of. It feels like something passing around you, like a river you are standing in, but never carried by. You see it flow, you feel it move, but it never takes you with it. Because you are not moving toward an end. You are simply there, watching, endlessly. And as centuries turn into longer stretches, another change begins to take shape: memory. At first, you remember everything, every moment, every detail, every experience. But the human mind was never built for eternity. It was designed for limits, for a lifespan that ends, not for an existence that continues forever. Your memories begin to blur, not all at once, but gradually. Older moments become less clear, less detailed. Faces lose their sharpness, voices become distant. Events that once felt vivid fade into something softer, less defined. You try to hold on to them, to preserve them, to revisit them, but there are too many years, too many experiences, too many moments layered on top of each other, and your mind cannot keep all of it. So it lets go, not by choice, but by necessity. And over time, you realize something unsettling. You have lived through centuries, but you cannot fully remember them. At some point, you begin to notice something else, not in the world around you, but in the way you experience it. The passage of time, once something you felt clearly, becomes distant. Days blur together. Years pass without weight. Decades feel like moments that never fully formed, because when time never runs out, it loses its urgency, and without urgency, attention begins to drift. You start to forget not just the past, but parts of the present. Conversations fade faster. Moments lose their clarity almost as soon as they happen, not because they are unimportant, but because your mind is overwhelmed. Too many experiences, too many layers of memory, too much time without pause. Your thoughts begin to simplify, not by choice, but as a way to continue. Complexity becomes harder to hold, details harder to keep, and so your mind adapts. It filters. It reduces. It lets go of what it cannot carry, until what remains is not the full depth of what you've lived, but fragments, pieces, echoes of something much larger. You try to fight it, to remember more, to hold on to names, places, stories, but every attempt feels incomplete, because for every memory you recover, countless others have already slipped away, and with that, your sense of identity begins to change, not suddenly, but slowly over time, because who you are is built on what you remember. Your past shapes your present, your experiences define your thoughts, but when your past becomes unclear, when your memories are incomplete, what anchors your identity, you begin to feel less defined, not empty, but uncertain, as if parts of you have been replaced, not by something new, but by something vague, something that lacks detail, something that lacks clarity. And as that feeling grows, you start to question something deeper. If you cannot fully remember your past, are you still the same person who lived it? Or are you just a continuation of something that no longer exists? The question doesn't have an answer, because there is no clear line, no moment where the old you ends and something else begins, only a gradual shift, a quiet transformation, one that never stops, because time continues, endlessly, and with every passing moment, more of the past fades, more of your identity softens, more of what once felt certain becomes unclear. You begin to rely less on memory and more on the present, but even the present feels unstable, because it doesn't stay long enough to feel real. It appears, and then it's gone, replaced by the next moment, and the next, and the next, without pause, without rest, without meaningfully settling into something you can hold. And over time, that constant flow begins to feel exhausting, not physically, but mentally, because your mind was never meant to process an infinite sequence of experiences. It was meant to live, remember, and eventually stop. But for you, there is no stopping, only continuation, and with that continuation comes a gradual loss of structure, not in the world, but within yourself. Your thoughts become simpler, your reactions slower, your emotional responses more distant, not because you no longer feel, but because you have felt too much, too many times, too many variations of the same moments, and eventually, those moments begin to blend together. Joy feels familiar, loss feels familiar, every emotion, every experience becomes something you've encountered before, not once, not twice, but countless times, and when something is repeated endlessly, it begins to lose its impact, its intensity, its ability to surprise, and without surprise, without contrast, everything begins to feel the same. Not identical, but close enough that the differences no longer matter. And as that happens, another shift takes place. Your connection to the world weakens, not because the world has changed, but because your relationship to it has. You are no longer moving through life in the same way. You are no longer shaped by time. You are outside of it, watching it, experiencing it, but not defined by it. And that distance continues to grow, because every moment that passes adds to the gap between you and everything else, a gap that can never close, because everything else is still moving toward an end, still following a path with a destination, still part of a system that you have left behind, and you are still here, still aware, still continuing, but slowly becoming something different, something less connected, less defined, less anchored in the things that once gave life its meaning. Because meaning, like identity, depends on limits, on boundaries, on the idea that something will end. Without that end, everything stretches, everything fades, everything loses its shape. And as you continue forward, through a time that never stops, you begin to understand something unsettling, that living forever is not just about continuing to exist. It is about slowly becoming something else, something that no longer fits within the world it came from, something that exists, but no longer belongs. Eventually, something else begins to change. Not your body, not your surroundings, but the way you experience connection. At first, relationships had weight. They mattered. They shaped your decisions, your emotions, your sense of purpose. People were not just part of your life. They were the center of it. But over time, that center begins to shift. Not because you want it to, but because it has to. Every connection you form, every bond you create, has the same ending. Not for you, for them. And no matter how many times you go through it, no matter how many lives you share moments with, the pattern never changes. They arrive. They exist beside you for a while, and then they leave. Not suddenly, not always painfully, but inevitably, and you remain. At first, you try to hold on to it, to care as deeply as you once did, to invest yourself fully in every connection, because that's what makes life feel real. But over time, that effort becomes harder to sustain, because every attachment carries a certainty, a quiet understanding that it will not last. And slowly, your mind begins to protect itself, not by shutting down completely, but by creating distance, a small space between you and others, enough to feel safe, enough to soften the impact. You still talk, you still share moments, you still exist alongside people, but something is different, something less intense, less rooted, because deep down, you know how it ends, and that knowledge changes everything. You begin to see people differently, not as permanent parts of your world, but as passing experiences. Temporary intersections in a timeline that only you continue to follow, and as that perspective settles in, your behavior shifts, you become quieter, more observant, less reactive. Because reacting implies urgency. It implies that something must be addressed now, before it's too late. But for you, it is never too late. There is always more time, and that abundance of time changes how you value it. Moments no longer feel rare, opportunities no longer feel limited. Everything can be postponed, everything can be revisited, everything can be experienced later. And because of that, the present loses its importance. It becomes just one of many moments, in an endless sequence that never ends. You begin to delay things, not intentionally, but naturally, because there is no pressure, no deadline, no reason to act now instead of later. And over time, that habit grows, until later becomes your default, not because you don't care, but because nothing feels urgent enough to demand your attention. And as urgency fades, so does motivation. Not completely, but enough to notice, because motivation is often driven by limits, by the idea that time is short, that something must be done before it's too late. But when it is never too late, that drive weakens. You still move, you still act, but without the same intensity, without the same sense of purpose. And gradually, your life becomes slower, not in time, but in meaning, because meaning comes from action, from choices made under pressure, from moments that matter because they cannot be repeated. But in your case, everything can be repeated, everything can be delayed, everything can be experienced again. And that infinite possibility begins to feel like a lack of direction, because when all paths are open, none of them feel necessary. None of them feel urgent. None of them feel like they must be taken. And so, you drift, not physically, but mentally, emotionally, through time, through experiences, through moments that pass without leaving the same impact they once did. And in that drifting, another realization begins to take shape. That immortality is not just the absence of death, it is the absence of endings. And endings are what give things their meaning. A conversation matters because it ends. A moment feels special because it cannot last forever. A life has value because it is limited. But when there is no ending, those boundaries disappear. And without boundaries, meaning begins to stretch, to blur, to fade. Not completely, but enough to feel the difference. Enough to notice that something is missing, something subtle but essential. And as that feeling grows, you begin to understand something deeper. That living forever is not just about continuing to exist. It is about existing in a way that slowly removes the very things that once made existence meaningful. Because without limits, without urgency, without endings, life becomes something else, something quieter, something less defined, something that continues, but no longer feels the same. After enough time, you stop thinking in years. You stop measuring anything the way you used to. Because measurements only matter when they lead somewhere, when they point toward an ending, a goal, a destination. But for you, there is no destination, only continuation. And so your perspective begins to stretch beyond anything human. You watch entire generations appear, grow, and disappear. You see cultures rise, define themselves, then slowly dissolve. Ideas that once shaped the world, replaced by others that feel just as certain, just as temporary. At first, you tried to stay involved, to follow each shift, to understand every change. But eventually, It becomes too much. Not overwhelming in a chaotic sense, but exhausting in its repetition, because everything follows a pattern, different faces, different places, different names, but the same underlying rhythm: birth, growth, change, end. And then, again, you begin to recognize these cycles before they fully unfold. You see the beginnings of something, and already understand how it will evolve, how it will peak, how it will fade. And because of that, surprise becomes rare, not impossible, but increasingly uncommon, and without surprise, something important begins to fade. Curiosity, the desire to discover, to explore, to understand, weakens, not because there is nothing left to learn, but because you have already seen too many versions of the same story. You can still observe, still experience, still exist within the world, but your relationship to it has changed. You are no longer discovering, you are recognizing. And recognition does not carry the same energy as discovery. It is quieter, less intense, less compelling. And over time, that difference grows. You find yourself stepping back, not physically, but mentally, becoming more of an observer than a participant. You watch events unfold, but feel less need to intervene, less desire to influence, because you know that whatever happens, another version of it will happen again, in a different form, at a different time, but with the same structure. And so, your involvement decreases, not out of indifference, but out of understanding, a deep awareness that everything is part of a pattern that does not depend on you. And as that awareness settles in, your sense of purpose begins to shift. At one time, purpose came from goals, from things you wanted to achieve, from directions you chose to follow. But goals depend on limits. They exist because time is finite, because opportunities are not endless, because there is a need to act before something is lost. Without that limitation, goals lose their urgency, their necessity, their weight. You can still set them, still pursue them, but there is always the knowledge that you can stop, pause, return later, because later always exists, and when later is guaranteed, now becomes less important, less defining, less meaningful, and slowly, purpose becomes something harder to hold on to, not because it disappears, but because it no longer feels required. You exist, but without the same sense of direction, without the same drive to move toward something, because movement implies progress, and progress implies an endpoint. But in your case, there is no endpoint, only an endless path, stretching forward without limit. And walking that path begins to feel different, not like a journey, but like a continuation without destination. You still think, still reflect, still experience the passage of existence, but your thoughts become more abstract, more distant from immediate concerns. You begin to think less about individual moments, and more about patterns, less about specific events, and more about the nature of events themselves, why things repeat, why systems behave the way they do, why existence follows certain structures. Because when you have infinite time, your focus shifts from living within the moment to observing the structure of moments. And in that shift, you begin to see something clearly, that everything around you is temporary, not just in the sense that it ends, but in the sense that it is constantly being replaced. Nothing stays the same, nothing remains fixed, everything changes, everything evolves, everything eventually disappears, and you are the only constant, the only thing that does not follow that rule. And that realization creates a distance that cannot be removed, because you are no longer part of the same system. You are outside of it, watching it move, watching it transform, watching it repeat. And as that distance grows, another question begins to form, not urgent, not loud, but persistent. If everything changes, and you do not, what does that make you? not in a physical sense, but in a conceptual one. Are you still part of the world, or are you something separate, something that exists alongside it, but does not belong to it? The question has no immediate answer, but it stays, quietly, following you through every moment, because as time continues, and everything else continues to change, you remain unchanged, unending, and increasingly, unlike everything around you. Eventually, you stop trying to hold on to the world, not because it disappears, not because it loses all meaning, but because your connection to it becomes too thin to sustain. At some point, you realize something simple, but impossible to ignore. Everything around you is temporary, not in the distant sense, not in the abstract, but in a way you can feel over and over again. Places you once knew no longer exist, not destroyed, but replaced, rebuilt into something new, given a different purpose, a different identity, until the original is gone, and only you remember it. People you once cared about become names you struggle to recall, faces you can no longer fully picture, voices that exist only as faint impressions. Because memory, even over an endless life, cannot remain complete. It adapts, it simplifies, it lets go of details that no longer fit within its limits. And as it does, your past becomes less defined, less personal, less real. You know that you lived through countless moments. You know that you experienced entire lifetimes. But the clarity is gone, replaced by a sense of distance, as if those lives belonged to someone else, someone you were but no longer are. And that distance extends to the present, because if the past cannot be fully held, the present cannot be fully anchored. Moments pass, conversations happen, experiences unfold, but they settle more lightly, they do not sink as deeply, because your mind has learned that nothing stays long enough to remain unchanged, and so it stops trying to hold everything. It allows things to pass, to move through you rather than define you, and in doing so, your relationship with reality becomes quieter, less reactive, less intense. You observe more than you engage. You notice more than you feel, not because you have lost the ability to feel, but because feeling requires contrast. It requires beginnings and endings. It requires change that matters. And when everything repeats, when everything cycles endlessly, that contrast becomes harder to find. Joy still exists, but it feels familiar, predictable, something you have encountered too many times to feel new. Loss still exists, but it carries less weight, not because it is unimportant, but because it is expected, a pattern that has played out countless times before. And so your emotions shift, not disappearing, but becoming more balanced, more neutral, less extreme, because extremes require limits. They require moments that stand apart from everything else. But when everything stretches into an endless line, nothing stands out in the same way. And as that emotional balance settles in, another transformation begins. Your sense of time fades even further. You no longer experience it as a sequence, not day by day, not year by year, but as a continuous flow, a single, unbroken movement. Moments blend together, events lose their separation, because there is no reason to divide them, no reason to mark one as more important than another. Everything becomes part of the same ongoing presence, and in that presence, you begin to exist differently, not as someone moving through time, but as something that exists within it, without being shaped by it. You are no longer defined by change. You are the constant within change, and that constant creates a distance that cannot be bridged, because everything else continues to evolve, to transform, to move forward, while you remain, always there, always aware, but no longer part of the same process. And as that awareness deepens, you begin to understand something subtle, but undeniable, that being unable to die is not just about surviving everything, It is about outlasting everything, not just people, not just places, but ideas, systems, entire ways of thinking. You witness the rise of beliefs and their eventual fading. You see certainty turn into doubt, and doubt turn into something else. Over and over again. And through all of it, you remain unchanged, not influenced in the same way, not carried by the same currents, because you have seen too many versions to fully commit to any single one, and so your perspective becomes wider, more detached, less tied to the moment. You understand more, but feel less urgency to act on that understanding, because action implies impact. It implies that something you do now will matter in the long term. But when you have experienced endless time, the concept of long-term changes. Everything becomes temporary, everything becomes part of a larger pattern, and your role within that pattern feels smaller, not insignificant, but less defined, less necessary, because the pattern continues, with or without you. And as that realization settles in, your existence becomes quieter, not empty, not meaningless, but less driven, less structured, less tied to the expectations that once shaped your life. You still exist, still observe, still think, but in a way that is no longer centered on change, or progress, or outcome, because those concepts belong to a world with limits, and you have moved beyond those limits into something else, something that continues, but no longer follows the same rules. In the end, there is no moment when it stops, no final breath, no last thought, no closing scene, because for you, there's no end. What began as a question, a strange, impossible idea, what if you couldn't die, has led somewhere deeper than expected, not into power, not into freedom, but into something quieter, something far more complex. Because living forever was never about escaping death. It was about facing everything that comes after it, every moment that continues, when nothing forces it to stop, every experience that repeats, when nothing marks it as final, every connection that fades, when you are the only one who remains. And, slowly, through time that never ends, you begin to understand something essential. That life as you once knew it was shaped by its limits, by the knowledge that it would end, by the urgency that created meaning, by the boundaries that gave moments their weight. Without those limits, everything changes, not all at once, not dramatically, but gradually, quietly, inevitably. Meaning stretches, emotion softens, purpose becomes harder to define, not because they disappear, but because they were never meant to exist without an ending. And yet, you continue, not as you were, not as something completely different, but as something in between, something that exists, but no longer experiences existence in the same way. You still see the world, still witness its changes, still observe the endless movement of time, but you are no longer part of its rhythm. You are outside of it, a constant, in a system built on change. And that position is not loud, not painful, not dramatic. It is quiet, a kind of stillness within motion, a sense of distance within presence. Because when everything moves forward and you do not, the world begins to feel far away, even when you are standing inside it. And as that distance grows, another realization begins to settle in. That immortality is not just the continuation of life, it is the transformation of it into something that no longer follows the same rules, something that no longer depends on beginnings or endings, something that simply is, endlessly, without conclusion, without closure, without release. And maybe that is the true weight of it, not the idea of living forever, but the reality of never stopping, never reaching a point where everything is complete, never arriving at a moment that feels final, only continuing through time that stretches without limit, through a world that changes without you, through an existence that never gives you the one thing that once defined everything, an ending. And so, as you sit there now, still within the boundaries of a normal life, still moving forward one moment at a time, there is something to notice, something simple, something easy to ignore, that the limits you have, the time you are given, the fact that things end, is not just a restriction, it is what gives everything its meaning, because without an end, there is no urgency. Without urgency, there is no value, and without value, even existence itself begins to fade into something quieter, something less defined, something that continues, but no longer feels the same. So maybe the question was never about escaping death. Maybe it was about understanding it, understanding why it exists, understanding what it gives to life, and what would be lost if it were taken away. Because in a world where nothing ends, everything slowly loses its place. And in that endless continuation, the most human part of existence begins to disappear,